I really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation tonight, because I think this is really special. That people get together and talk about science and shed light onto issues from many different directions. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about exactly what's on this title, and I'm going to structure this lecture into two parts. And the first part is one that affects, that basically lines out a technical solution that we in the plant biology team at the SOG have, that we think we might solve a very pressing problem for our planet with plants. And the second part is about basically the technology that we're going to use for that, and the question whether it is better to use traditional breeding technologies to make plants in a certain way to help us solve this crisis, this climate crisis, or whether we can actually, because time is so pressing, use a different technology. Okay, so the first part of this is something very new, something that we came up in the last year, over the last 1 or 2 years at the SOG, even before I joined the SOG Institute last year, and that is to take the knowledge and the expertise that we have. We have 5 professors at the SOG Institute who work in very fundamental basic biology. And so we work in model systems, we don't work in application. But we over the past years and decades, our field has understood plants to such an extent that we actually think we can use our knowledge to solve a very big problem. And this problem is that actually our world is confronted with probably the largest threat in its existence, at least in the last couple of 100 million years. And the reason of this threat is that we are dealing with 2 different things. One of it is that the world's population is growing massively. Within the next 30 years, we'll probably be 10 billion on this planet. So obviously, because people, it's not only that the world population will increase, but it's also that the middle class will increase. And as we all know, middle class likes to drive cars, have heated homes, ACs, and all this, right? So there will be a demand that is increased just by the increasing population of food, feed, fuel, and fiber that the Earth never has seen before. And because we are a carbon-based economy, so basically we generate most of the energy by burning fossil fuels, we generate a lot of CO2. And CO2, I'm not going to tap into this controversy because it's, scientifically there's actually no doubt about it, that CO2 is basically a main cause, the increasing CO2 concentration in the air of changing average temperatures on this planet. So we are heating up the planet by our activities, which is basically linked to burning carbon, right? Coal, gas, and others. And at the same time, we will need more, and on the global scale, we need more food, feed, fuel, and fiber, right? The problem is that if the world heats up, the crops that are the basis of our society will be stressed, right? We all, we eat, we basically use fibers, we use fuel derived from crops. But if these crops are stressed, they will be producing less. But on the other hand, there will be more demand. So it's actually, it's really a very gloom kind of outlook. So I think we are in this situation right now that we really have to act, whatever this will mean, to be able to support without huge catastrophes the burgeoning population, and to somehow counteract the increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, because that threatens not only the crops that we eat and our civilization is based on, but also all ecosystems. Okay, so going back a little bit from this gloomy outlook, is what is actually, so how does carbon dioxide get actually in the air? Why is it actually that we have every year more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is highly correlated with the increase of temperatures worldwide? So you can see this on this little graph here, that there is a large carbon dioxide cycle. So carbon dioxide cycle is in the air, but by the activity of plants that do photosynthesis, so they take carbon dioxide and sunlight and water and make it into all the biomaterials that we use, actually CO2 gets fixed, right? And then on the other hand, this fixed CO2 gets released by humans eating plants, animals eating plants, humans eating animals sometimes, by burning fossil fuels that have been stored, that is carbon stored in the ground, and by other natural causes that we are well aware of, for instance, burning vegetation, right? So usually this is a very nice cycle because it is in balance. Only that ever since the industrialization, we are digging out coal and gas from the soil and basically increase this part, this basically burning of carbon and releasing of CO2. And if you want to have the numbers, that is every year by natural, if you calculate the human activity out there, where 840 gigatons of CO2 is released, and plants capture every year 860 gigatons of carbon by photosynthesis, make it into biopolymers, biomaterials that we then use for feed, fuel, and fiber. So usually without man activities, we are actually right now 20 gigatons in the good, if you want to make this very simplistic calculation. However, human activity leads to a release of 35 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. So we basically, every year right now, we basically deposit 15 gigatons in excess, more in the atmosphere, right? So that is the problem that we have to solve. But compared to these numbers, essentially, it's actually not that much. Like 15 gigatons to the activity that plants actually provide, fixing 860 gigatons, is only 2%, right? So if we compare to the global photosynthetic activity of plants to take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, like the stuff that we actually add every year in the atmosphere is actually not that much. So that's why we think actually plants can be a solution, because if we increase this part of this a little bit, we can actually make a big difference. The alternative would be to ask whether only by ceasing our carbon burning activities this could be changed, right? So if we want to not add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere on a global scale, we basically need to use 50% less of coal, gas, or the fossil energy. And that, I mean, you can imagine is very, very unrealistic, at least to me, right? I mean, even if we stop driving our cars tomorrow, somebody else will buy the cars and the gas and do it, right? So this is actually a very impractical solution, and not really considering the population growth that we have. However, as I told you earlier, if we put these 15 gigatons that we are in excess in perspective to the 860 gigatons that plants already take from the air and fix, it's not that much, right? So the idea is that we actually make plants that are better in storing carbon stably and taking this carbon dioxide out of the air using plants. And we propose two approaches. One is using terrestrial plants, so the land plants that we all know, to store a large proportion of the carbon dioxide that the human civilization emits every year. And the second approach is actually doing something that is really, really urgently needed to make sure that the marine ecosystems keep surviving, because there's a lot of carbon dioxide that's fixed in the oceans, and there's a lot of loss of those plants that do this in the ocean. So we try to approach this from a conservation perspective as well. Okay, coming to the first aim. The idea is actually pretty simple. We need to make plants much more efficient in stably storing carbon in the soil. So right now, plants store carbon in their leaves, in their wood, in all their organs, right? They make biomaterials, but usually that gets very easily degraded by fungi or bacteria. So the idea is, if we make somehow plants more efficient in storing carbon very, very stable, that it cannot be released quickly, and if we do this to the extent that we make plants 20 times more than current plants are, we actually can sequester 50% of the human emitted CO2 using 6% of the worldwide agricultural land. That is a lot of land. That's Texas and Arizona combined, but on the global scale. But it is doable if you think that every farmer would put a little bit, 6% of its farm with plants that are much better in carbon sequestering. It's actually not so far away from. I mean, it's probably possible. All right. So how are we going to do this? Making plants 20 times more efficient to store carbon stably. So the first part of this is to actually find a molecule that is not easily degraded. So that fungi or bacteria are typically not very efficient in degrading and releasing the carbon dioxide. So we want that the plant actually fixes the CO2 like it already does and puts into a material that is stably in the soil, right? And the material that we have found through preliminary experiments and data is actually called suberin. It is a polymer, so it contains a lot of carbon atoms in its molecular structure, and it is very, very, very resilient to decomposition. So it is one of the most longest-lived carbon forms in the soil. And the nice thing about suberin that you might know as cork, and anyone, so Joe Noel, my colleague who is also in the audience, he always comes up with this experiment that he did a couple of years ago, throwing cork in his compost, and the cork doesn't degrade, and that's suberin, right? So, and we know the biochemical pathways that make suberin. So the idea is to basically try to enhance those pathways of the plants that actually produce suberin, right? And so then if the plant would make enough suberin, it could be stable in the soil. The second is that if the root system produces this stable carbon polymer, we're gonna make the root system bigger and deeper, that basically much more of the polymer can be stored in the soil. And for this, we basically will use a perennial plant, so a plant that lives multiple years and doesn't die every year like most plants that are used in agriculture, because they have actually very extensive rooting systems, and they are also very good for soil health, and plus they are actually more resistant to extreme environments, such as drought or flooding. So the trick will be to basically have a plant that has an extensive root system, lives a long time, and can, over the lifetime of its existence, put a lot of carbon very stably in the soil. That's the simple idea. And for this, at the SOC, we actually have a biology team that is very well suited to this, to all those different aspects, to facilitate the carbon storage. So Joe Noel leads a group that's expert in biochemical pathways. I'm the root expert, so we know the genes and the genetic variants that are important for getting an extensive and deep root system. We are all very well seasoned in natural variation, not taking genes from other organisms, but using the genes that are already there in plants to actually achieve those aims. And we all also are interested in the plant adaptation to the environment, because any plant that we will put out there needs to be adapted to the climate of tomorrow. The climate in 10 years will unfortunately be in many places more harsh, more extreme than now, right? So if we basically will generate an ideal plant that is able to sequester carbon, it only makes sense and is a viable option if these plants will not die because of extreme of more drought or more flooding or other environmental changes in those areas. Okay, so that's us. Check us out on the webpage. But we came together as a team, and we started to decide we're going to start this project and try to save the world by sequestering carbon with plants with the knowledge that we already have. All right, so that was the first approach. We think we can actually generate a land plant that is perennial, makes the soil better, because that's what happens if you don't till every year, for instance, and can sequester carbon. But all these things will not matter if the ocean plants will go away the way they do right now, because the ocean is a huge carbon dioxide sink. So especially seagrass takes a lot of the carbon dioxide and puts it into biomass, which then basically stays in the ocean and is not decomposed, right? So if the seagrass, for instance, will die, we're going to lose this battle. It will be an uphill battle to actually use plants to get carbon dioxide off the air. The reason for this is it has actually 30 times more carbon storage capacity than terrestrial plants. And so we really need to do something. On this slide, you see here this Zostera marina seagrass species that you probably all seen on the beaches sometimes when it basically gets after like a stormy day. You see lots of it at the beach, and you see that this species occurs worldwide. And what this picture actually can show you, if you think about it, is that seagrasses are already adapted for very different climates, right? If they can grow in the northern Pacific area, and if they can grow around Florida, right? There are seagrass varieties that actually can withstand different temperature regimes and other environmental effects. So the key is that you need to know which seagrass species you can use to restore seagrass populations at which place, right? And this also takes a lot of knowledge on the natural variation and some kind of prediction. All right. So what we want to do is to use our knowledge about like the genes of plants and their genetic variants and how they adapt to survival rates and fitness in different environmental conditions, and then help inform the restoration. And they are, of course, also very economically and ecologically important, not just because they are seagrass, they sequester carbon dioxide, but they are actually the breeding ground for fishes and many other economically and ecologically relevant species. Okay, so that was the quick overview what we want to do and what we really want to achieve. Where we currently starting our experiments. We are looking for philanthropists to fund more of this work and for granting agencies. And so the second question is a technical question, and that is kind of hitting to the heart of this ethics series. And the question is, which kind of technology should we use? We are the scientists. We know, we think it's possible to generate an idea plant that can sequester carbon, but how should we go about it, right? And the reason why this is very different from many other breeding projects, conventional, is that we will need a lot of different gene variants that do a lot of different things. We will need more and deeper roots. We will need enhanced suberin production, and we will need plants that are adapted to different environments. And so those will be more than a handful of genes. And the question is, what is actually the best way to go about this, right? So the first possibility how we can change plants, and humankind has changed plants for several thousand years, 10,000 years, right? That's what we eat today, is that you change the genetics by breeding. So you take a plant that has a certain property that you like, and you're going to cross it with another plant that whose properties you like, and then you do it over and over again, and then you have changed the genetics in a way that you'll have a plant that you like, right? That kind of explained how we got from watermelons this size to watermelons this size over the past couple of thousand years, or from Theosynthi to corn, from a cob that was like this to a cob that is like this, right? That was all genetic alteration by breeding, using this kind of technology. And so essentially what you do when you cross plants, you take a couple of thousand genes. So plants have around 30,000 genes. So you have 30,000 gene variants, you kind of mix them, and then you take out whatever you like, right? And so in a way, it's kind of like mixing two card decks and then splitting it up randomly into two, and then going, the next generations to try to get what you want, right? So it's a very in a way, random and slow process. And so the benefits of this breeding, so we could try to increase the suberin and change the rooting using breeding. The benefits, it has proven to be very successful because all our crops are based on this, right? And the Green Revolution, like this very strong increase of yield in the 50s and 60s, was entirely based on these breeding methods, but it was very slow. So slowness is the big disadvantage. If we think of climate change and population growth, I mean, we're talking about time spans of 30 years where it can get very, very tough, right? So whether or not you can change plants in that way using breeding within 20, 30 years will be very tight. Plus, because we are looking at very different traits, so we are looking at rooting depth and more suberin, and environmental stress resilience will be also very difficult. Now, the second approach that people use in the lab a lot, right, to study the function of genes is genetic engineering. So the basic idea is very similar. You use genetics to change a plant. And so you identify a gene or a genetic variant, right? So genetic variants are the variants that make us, for instance, different. For the most part, we have the same genes, but the same gene is different, slightly different. And that's why we all look different, right? And we have a couple of, a couple of thousand genes that look slightly different, and that makes our differences. That's the same for plant breeding. You identify the versions of the same gene that make plants a little bit different, right? So you identify this gene or the genetic variant, and then you just take it using molecular biology tools and either put it in this plant as an additional gene, or right now we are in a technological revolution called CRISPR-Cas9. We can actually excise the old gene and put the other gene in, so we can replace variants. Just imagine if we could replace, people try to replace disease variants in humans with like healthy variants, right? You kind of like swap it out. All right, so the big benefits is of the genetic engineering, and that's why it has been attempted in the past, is it is very precise because you're just dealing with one gene. You're not basically dealing with the whole 2 card decks that you kind of mix and then see what comes out, but you're dealing with one card that you put in there, right? So you know exactly what you kind of put in there. You can deal with multiple genes because you can take multiple of those gene variants and put it in the genome. It has been very successful, mostly for traits that don't affect the quality of the food so much, but rather the profit for farmers or corporations, like herbicide resistance. So you all know this Roundup Ready crops, right? Where the big advantage is you can like kill all other weeds with the herbicide, and your herbicide resistant crop is not killed. But also disease resistance. For instance, this saved the whole papaya fruit industry of the US 15 years ago. Okay, so the disadvantages, is, for instance, there are some risks that if you include in your, other than herbicide resistance, but your other trait, additionally herbicide resistance, because it's very convenient, farmers actually tend to only use this herbicide all the time, and that leads to this emergence, or can lead to the emergence of super weeds. So weeds that you just cannot kill using traditional herbicides, right? So it's not necessarily a property of genetic engineering, but it's rather that you can put in stuff there that can lead people to a certain, practice that then leads to, it's like if like all the doctors prescribe you antibiotics all the time, you're going to have antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that's the same with weeds. You generate an evolutionary pressure. All right. And there is an ideological public controversy that can really damage projects and scientists. And a lot of people in my field are very scared about this because there's so much emotion in these debates that it can be very damaging, even if you have very good ideas, right? So there are general risks for both breeding and genetic engineering, and this will also be true, of course, for any project, including our ideal plant. So if you change a plant genetically, it can, of course, crossbreed by pollen. The pollen will go in the air and might actually fertilize another plant somewhere else. And then you have this mixture of this changed plant, be it using breeding or being gene technology, right? Genetic engineering. It's not something specific to genetic engineering. It's just if you have population of plants that can interbreed with your specifically bred plant, that is something that's very hard to control often. And then the new gene variants, especially this is true for a concern for food, can potentially lead to allergies or to adverse reactions, like in the case for basically anything you do, right? So if you cross two different plant varieties the conventional way, there is the possibility that there might be more allergens for some case, or more toxins, right? So the key is basically testing and to know how to deal with this, right? So if you would, I always tell my students, if you would eat a raw potato of some strains, you would die, right? So it's not that this potato is unnatural or anything. It's just that it's important to know about food safety, and that is not an inherent problem of genetic engineering or breeding, right? Okay, so I think the most interesting part in terms of the ethics is now this. So I think the time horizon by which we really have to do something about the carbon dioxide concentration in the air is really pressing. And given the growing population, maybe not in this country, but in many other parts of the world, that will be actually something that will lead to, I don't know, dilemma, but will lead to a very interesting question. So the first thing is, so we could make the ideal plan, and that's what we plan, using making a cover crop, that is used for feed. And I think in terms from the health perspective, this is rarely like a really deeply debated ethical problem, right? But if we think of 10 billion people in 30 years, we will actually compete, carbon sequestration might compete with food production, right? And so the natural solution would be to merge, to actually have food plants that at the same time not only produce more food, but also at the same time sequester more carbon, right? Because the agricultural land, the soils on this planet are very limited, right? Once the soil is destroyed, it will never come back, or at least not for the next couple of thousand years, for the most soils, right? So there are limited soil resources. So if we have to feed people, and if we want to use plants, and I think this is actually the only quick solution for this problem, to sequester carbon, we will need to combine, we will actually make, legumes, for instance, like this nice lentils, that actually can be eaten and at the same time sequester a lot of carbon. So this is kind of the debate that will be very interesting, I think. Just like to close this, so I think I always like, I work at the Salk Institute, and I really like Jonas Salk, who gave us the polio vaccine. And I think this is like such an amazing ethical statement, which I think is really imperative, at least to me, that our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. I think that sums it up really, really well what we are trying to achieve here. Thank you.
So I wanted to start, before we get into questions from the audience, with a generic issue about science that I think is important for thinking about where we go with science. You clearly are passionate about your directions, citing the quote from Jonas Salk and the value of what scientists do. That's clearly very important to you. But I'm wondering about your path that brought you here. Did you start with an interest in biology? Did you start with an interest in climate change and say biology might be a tool to deal with this? How did you get to where you are, which sounds unusual to me? So.
Well, I was very interested in biology. So my main motivation was always to understand how the world works, and especially organisms. And I came actually to plants very late. So at the end of my undergrad, I always thought I would do more. I would be more in the health, medical related genetics. But then I realized what plants actually do. So I kind of overcame my plant blindness, because plants, they grow at a place and they can't run away. Still they survive, right? And that's actually like a tremendous achievement. And so I became interested, how does it actually work? How can obviously they don't have a brain, so how does it genetically work that they actually can respond to the environment and that they can grow. And so, but still I was very interested in very fundamental aspects. But over the past, I would say 2-3 years, with becoming apparent that nothing actually happens, or almost nothing, that counteracts climate change and carbon dioxide, with the knowledge that actually plants have evolved mainly to fix carbon dioxide into biomaterials. Together with discussions with my SAW colleagues, I was wondering why it's not really obvious that nobody used the power plants to fight climate change. So that's how I come here. I was always deeply concerned about, of course, about politics and the human condition, but this is the first time I really merged my, profession and my interest in genetics and biology with the ambition to help change something.
Okay. And so now I want to lead into some specific questions about the technology you described. So where are things really? I mean, how the theory sounds absolutely fabulous, but in terms of practically, how far are we? And you see the hurdles now being more scientific or more political? So how far are we from saying, here's something that works, and being able to?
So we have a couple. So we know that a couple of the pieces work. We know that that there are genes and variants that if you change them, you can enhance suberin production. We know that suberin is very stable in the soil, and we know how we're going to get deep roots, or that there are ways genetically to get deep roots. And we're actually working already in a species, Lotus japonicus, which is a legume that we think might be the first iteration of this ideal plant. Now, like, all those parts exist, but there's still much more research needed to kind of like combine them and to optimize some of those parts. So I think we are still 5 years away from kind of the first prototype of an ideal plant, but I think scientifically and technically, I could say if we are able to find sources for doing those experiments, like more grant money, we will be able to do it in 5 years, I would say. But then the next hurdle, as you said, I think is political, right? Because a lot of these things in this arena are based on how much value is placed on carbon dioxide and the climate. For instance, one way, the only way how one could actually have people plant this is if there's some way that they have an incentive, right? And also that there's enough land. So depending on the politics, whether carbon trading is something that would be useful for this, you could, energy companies could buy a certificate that so much of carbon dioxide gets buried by, this amount of plants, and they could basically then, balance their carbon dioxide footprint. But this is all political. So I would say I'm very optimistic regarding the science. With the policy, I'm an optimist, you might know. But with the policy, there are more unknowns. And that is something why I came here tonight, because I think it's very important to involve the public and get the word out that people who might have good ideas how to actually then get to the next step to provide the resources where those plants can grow, or the land and getting the the framework and the incentives into place is very important right now.
It makes sense. Did you have a question?
It's more an observation. It's amazing to me the resistance that's developed about genetic modification of organisms. And the improvement in the technology of both the CRISPR technology and the sequencing means you can do it with much more accuracy, much less possibility of error. But still, there's this deep there's this deep resistance, the fear that something horribly could go wrong. And my advice is that it makes perfect sense to focus on a food plant. But with a food plant, you're probably going to have the greatest resistance. And it might be better to get started developing one of these plants that's not regarded as a food, but will get the job done. Because I think the irrational, again, I'm using the wrong word, the fear that people are going to have of the technology is not going to go away. I know with nuclear power, people hoped that education would solve it. And it never did, it never will. And I'm afraid you might be up against the same thing. So a lot of care needs to be given, I think, to that aspect.
So that's an interesting point. So I don't know whether you feel like this is in your purview to sort out, but should we be working on the plants that we're going to use to line our freeways rather than plants we're going to eat?
I think that is, I mean, that is certainly our first ambition. Actually, like we're thinking of a multi-track program where most of the effort will be on non-food plants. But I think, I mean, realistically, especially in developing countries, there will be, there will be a shortage of land probably, because we're using the land already at a high capacity. Probably, and others might be much more qualified than I to judge that. But I mean, the needed increase in basically food might not be compatible with occupying land, large, areas of land with, plants that sequester carbon. But yeah, I agree. It's much easier, and that's why we're trying to sort this out right now. It's much easier to start with a non-food plant because it seems to be very special to people.
Yeah, and that's one avenue to address that concern that people are worried about risks of genetic engineering. But the other avenue that doesn't seem to have worked is the question of education. I think your point is a good one, that whatever the issue, people tend not to move just because they're given more facts. So given, I say that, and it is easy to stand back and say, well, I know the facts and other people don't, but the fact is that probably all of us in this room, there are arenas in which people would present us with facts about other things, and we won't see those facts because we have our own attitudes and perspectives. So the question that I'm going to ask next is, perhaps it would be worth asking, what are the risks that people see who fear genetic engineering? And what protections do we have for those risks? And that's just something that would be good for all of us to at least be able to articulate. So what is your understanding of what those risks are that people see?
So I think my view of this debate is it's to some extent confounded because there are always political, corporational aspects that are brought into this debate, right? It's very hard to separate like big ag from genetic engineering technology. But I want to put this aside because that's not in the arena of science, right? That's more a society question, like how do you actually want to structure the economies that deliver you food? But so scientifically, I think I know of three main reasons that people object to genetic engineering, especially in plants, and that is there is the possibility that you genetically engineer a plant and it produces pollen, and then basically by the sexual reproduction with another non-genetically engineered plant of the same species forms progeny that is then a hybrid of a genetically engineered plant and a non-genetically engineered plant. So economically, if you want to sell non-GMO food, that's of course very bad. If people test your seeds, your neighbor's field, had some GMO corn and then it went over and then you have GMO corn. So, I don't know how much this would be relevant for a plant that is per se not doing any doesn't have any threatening ability, especially if it's non-food. And then the second area of concern is that with food plants, and that is, I think, very much linked to food plant, is that by adding a foreign gene or transgene, and I think there is this misconception that it always needs to be a gene from a different species. It doesn't need to be. I mean, it can be this, from the same species, but a different strain, let's say from Australia and the US, that something happens and then something will be made by the plant that's toxic or allergenic. And that is of course possible, but also with any breeding. So if you cross any plants as I outlined, you have like thousands of components that basically can have reactions with thousands of other components. And so that always harbors the possibility that something unexpected happens. But from the last couple of thousand years of agriculture, where people have crossed a lot of, different strains of species, that is a rather rare event. And it seems, at least scientifically, there is no strong indication that this is something that's very specific to GMO that can happen. And then the third concern has to do something, and I outlined this previously, with the herbicide resistance. So much of the commercially available transgenic plants are resistant to herbicides. So they survive a treatment with like Roundup or other herbicides and others not. But because you're putting a lot of evolutionary pressure on the weeds, at some point they will evolve a resistance, much like their antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that is rather not, that's a consequence of this herbicide resistance, but not really it's not a necessary consequence. It's the way how you treat those plants, as far as I understand. So those are the three aspects that I think are of concern in the debate. And then, of course, a lot of other political things that are hard to rehash.
Yeah, and I just to underline, I mean, the second of those three, which is the allergic issue, is one that's probably there no differently between genetically modified organisms using genetic engineering and those by breeding. That's present in both cases. So, okay, good, thanks. We should turn to other.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. For those of us who follow the technology on negative emissions, the desert of options on the table right now make this especially interesting. But I noticed you posed this as an ethical question between whether to engage in traditional crossbreeding versus genetic engineering, as opposed to whether or not we should do either in the first place. I agree with you that we should. I think many of the public may disagree with that because they are under the misapprehension that somehow the world we live in some sense natural, including the work of farmers as being natural, and of course it isn't. Let me try a jiu-jitsu argument and see what you think of it, to argue that using CRISPRs is actually a preferable way to proceed rather than traditional crossbreeding. I don't think there's a morally relevant difference between these two. I think it's merely a matter of risk assessment and benefit. You've made the argument that, of course, we're under the pressure of time, and that would militate in favor of CRISPRs over traditional approaches. But I think there's another argument in favor of CRISPRs over traditional crossbreeding, and that's that, at least as far as I know, the Harvard group that is developing CRISPRs is working on the technology of building in what I'll call, speaking with the vulgar, kill switches or specific vulnerabilities, which are deliberately engineered into the outcome so that you could switch it off in the face of any untoward consequences. And that seems to me much harder to do in a traditional crossbreeding approach. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting comment. So it is actually true that you can build in switches or genes and genetically engineered plants that can basically self-destruct, right, if you give it a signal. And it's true for this gene drives and other things that this is basically proposed. That actually has been proposed, and that's, I think that sounds like, to me, a very good idea to say, if you have outbreeding, if you have outcrossing, and something happens that you didn't anticipate, which I can't, which I don't anticipate at all, you could actually activate this, and then these plants all would die. It's an interesting question because, like, a big ag company actually proposed this in the past for their crops for this purpose, but then the public, because they called it then terminator genes, and then the public kind of went, it was before my time, there were a lot of angry people who basically then said, you're gonna, if somebody doesn't pay for it, you're gonna kill like this crop, right? And so, but I think it's a very interesting mechanism. Scientifically, those things are a little bit tricky. They need to be designed very, very carefully. And I think there are people in the human genetics area, like George Church, who think a lot about this, and you refer to that group. So that might be a very, very good idea. The nice thing with plants as opposed to animals is you can much easier track plants. So if you have, especially not a very strong outcrosser that largely selves, right? You could just like take a tractor and like till it. But certainly that would be a very interesting option if the concerns will emerge that are basically largely due to, you know, unintended consequences of propagation.
Okay, so I will preface this by saying that I'm on your side, but I'm also a self-avowed curmudgeon. And in that sense, I'll ask two questions. The first one is, what could possibly go wrong? And as in the butterfly effect, right? Little things can lead to greater things. And the second one is, isn't saving the planet also a form of job preservation? Because, as George Bernard Shaw said 150 years ago, but others have probably said it before him or since him, he said basically that science is always wrong because it never comes up with a solution without creating 10 more problems. So, in the argument, and not just for your field, I think all of us in any field, in the scientific field, we ought to have a better public discourse about those things, saying what can possibly go wrong.
So yeah, so I might comment on the second question first. So of course, science, for every solution you develop, you're basically, especially if it's applied in the world, I mean, the world is a dynamic system, other things happen, right? So risk assessment is very, very important, right? But I think science actually has made this word better, right? So, I mean, just going back to Jonas Salk, development of polio vaccine probably didn't have really a lot of unintended bad consequences, except from a lot of, you know, people getting spared like a really horrible fate, right? And then other, you know, there are other very good examples. I mean, we are fine. I mean, our child mortality rate is like really down. We are like very good with surviving, comparing ourselves like to 200 years ago, right? So I think science helps, but of course there's a lot of problems that can occur due to this dynamism of this world, right? That sometimes it's hard to assess the risk. So to the first now, risk assessment. So what could go wrong? So So I think to do this, you have to compare to other crops, let's say it, right? So we have a lot of artificial human engineered plants on this planet, like the corn and other crops, right? It is very, to me, actually, like these crops never have taken over the whole ecosystems, except with the help of the of farmers, right? So I think it's, if you have a slow-growing plant that puts a lot of energy in the roots, and into suberin production, it is rather unlikely that it will be a highly invasive species. However, it's something that one needs to assess and test, and to roll something out like this in stages that are really very thoroughly checked. But if we think of plants that basically generated havoc, in our civilization, there are really no. I mean, there's kudzu. But kudzu is a very fast-growing plant, so you could have anticipated that. But generally, with agronomically relevant plant, there is not a lot of, like aggressive, colonization of other areas. So I think that is something that seems rather unlikely. Now, the second thing would be, so what happens if the plants get so good at it that we get too much CO2 out of this atmosphere? But this will, this will. Huh?
We should be so lucky.
We should be so lucky, yes, exactly. I mean, that will take, hundreds of years. I mean, it's just like, you can do the calculations, right? So that will be a rather long-term problem, and then to find a way to eradicate, especially like cultured plants, is usually not a big problem. But I agree. I think every technology needs a fair assessment of its risks.
So just before we leave that risk question, because I was going to be a curmudgeon as well and ask that a similar question, but so one of the things that is a probable effect of developing a technology that might counteract carbon production, in this case, is that people will worry less about trying to restrict carbon production. And as you pointed out, the world's population will be drastically increasing. And as we all know, a vast majority of people on this planet right now do not have the resources yet to produce so much carbon. And it is plausible that they will get those resources over time. So if that happens, we're going to both be producing more carbon and trying to sequester more carbon. Let's assume that we can do that. What are the limits of this? I mean, I'm trying to picture, I've got a tree that I've created that's genetically engineered. It's producing all this suberin and this deep root structure. At some point, it maxes out, doesn't it? I mean, what happens and how far can we go with this?
So it has its limits. I mean, I said, like, when we calculated what could be done if we were to make plants 20 times more efficient, we would still need 6% of the arable land in this world to sequester 50% of our human excess carbon dioxide, right? So I mean, this will be a very so this is kind of it depends on policy how much you can do, right? So there is a maximum to it, and I think without societies trying to get more energy efficient, this is not the only solution. But I think in the urgency of this problem, I mean, we have to do everything that we can do to tackle this problem from different angles. And I don't think, when I think back in my school days in the 90s, I know in Europe at least people knew that is a problem. But nobody I know ever has reduced his or her carbon footprints. I mean, people just don't care. Because like the way, I mean, most people, I mean, there are very good people who do, but it's very hard to take like a decision today for a very abstract problem, and at least most of the people I know just, I mean, they don't scale back, and that I don't think from, apart from technological advantage, and there's a lot of promising things, solar panels in California, and in other places, but this is, we need to throw everything we have at this, otherwise this will be horrible, right? So I might put it in the words of my colleague Joanne Corey, who kind of has conceived this initiative a while ago. It's to buy us time, and that's what it is, right? We cannot solve the whole problem with it, but I mean, it can actually solve a significant part of this problem.
Yeah, I agree, and I think probably by the nature of the people who are showing up for these programs, most of the audience agrees we do need to try all of these things, but part of the calculation needs to be how do we deal with the consequence that instead of being more vigorous about trying to reduce our carbon footprint, we might say, oh, we can relax now because we have a solution. So communicating well what we're getting, what we're not getting seems to be part of the story.
No, absolutely. But I mean, I would doubt that anyone is. I mean, that a significant fraction of people really try hard to. I mean, would stop behaving right now, right? I mean, the reason why a lot of people install solar panels is because it's cheaper. It's not. I mean, many people. I mean, there will be many people who do it for the environment.
It helps a lot to.
It helps a lot, right? And the big changes is all. My perception is a lot about economy.
Okay, thanks. We should move on.
Apologies, I'm a layman, so I'll try to keep this question as not as broad as possible. But it's really difficult in today's political climate. It's so polarizing, especially here in America. Which it seems that we, especially since we have a leader, I use that term very loosely, who seems to dodge the idea of climate change, not even an idea, just the actual physical happening of it. So my question to you is, you mentioned earlier that you have seen some things that we've been doing here in California with the I already forgot. The solar panels, I've also seen a lot more of those windmills, especially in Tehachapi. What do you think we, as a country, can do to kind of help more with climate change, especially when it comes to coexisting with other nations? In a broad sense, it seems that we seem to have a problem with that. I don't know why. So in your opinion, what can we do? And also, what have you seen besides the solar panels that we have done that it is being useful and that we are trying to, take this very seriously in our country? So yeah, that would be my question to you. Like, what do you think we can do that's a little bit more helpful? How can we coexist with other nations who are scientists? And what have you seen us do so far that's on the right track?
Since that's broad-ranging, do you mind if I sort of focus that to say, what would you recommend Dr. Bush would say politically this country should be doing in the world stage?
Whatever you want to say.
Okay, I don't want to misconstrue your question. Okay.
Well, that's a very tough call. I think, from my perspective, I would say it's very important to limit carbon dioxide emissions as much as it is possible and as much as it is realistic. I moved to California last year, and I'm really, really impressed by by how many. Of course, it's very sunny here. Coming from Germany, and it's different. So there's a lot of things that happen in California that are really, really great, and I think I don't see any reason why this could not happen in other parts of the U.S. or on the federal level, because it's all about the incentives, right? It's all about generate kind of like nudging people to take decisions in their daily lives to avoid using more energy, like non-renewable energy. So I think. So my idea were like all countries would sit together and say what we can do to limit, burning, of fossil fuels, and how can we actually make technology better on a massive scale to try to tackle that problem. And I think the U.S. has a very, very good track record in tackling highly challenging technological problems. In other areas. Just think of the nuclear bomb of the Manhattan Project, which it's not the best thing but that was a huge scientific breakthrough in which the country and all the structures here kind of bundled so much energy and so much resources to within no time to get a massive technological breakthrough that that was very unlikely. So if there would be a Manhattan Project for carbon sequestering plants, I think that would be awesome.
So once again, we turn to German scientists to come over here and help us solve that problem. Okay, I think we'd better stop there. I want to thank you for a really interesting talk.